Schools are an inherently conservative social institution when it comes to sex and sexuality. Dress codes, curriculum, and the history of educational policies related to sexual harassment and discrimination illustrate how schools are agents of social control when it comes to sex and sexuality. In this video, we'll look at the relationship between schools, sex, and sexuality, and using a social constructionist approach, explore the ways in which educational institutions shape our norms and values related to sex and sexuality. There are multiple ways that schools demonstrate their control of young people's sexuality. School dress codes reinforce gendered messages about sexuality, specifically reinforcing the sexual double standard. In one study, a high school dress code declared that girls could not show their belly button or midriff, while boys had to wear their pants at their waistline without exposing their underclothes or skin. This dress code was focused on curtailing girls' sexuality, while the boys' restrictions were instead a reaction against urban or street fashion. Research has also shown that schools' conservative approaches to sexuality related issues result in LGBTQ students, faculty, and staff still struggling for acceptance and acknowledgement, with some schools being more accepting than others. Recently, schools have been under a lot of pressure to become safe spaces in the face of bullying and violence experienced by sexual minority and gender nonconforming youth, and increasing LGBTQ youth mobilization. A recent survey by the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network found that LGBTQ students avoid certain spaces in school where they feel uncomfortable. Some of the most common places LGBTQ students say they avoid include bathrooms, locker rooms, PE classes, athletic fields, cafeterias, hallways, buses, and parking lots. Harassment can occur at all levels of education: elementary school, middle school, and high school. But anti LGBTQIA violence and harassment increases dramatically in middle schools and throughout high school. In addition, research has shown that cyberbullying disproportionately affects LGBTQIA youth. For many students, college and university is the first time in which they're able to have open, honest, and frank discussions about sex and sexuality in an academic context. Many colleges and universities offer academic courses that cover issues related to sex and sexuality, such as queer theory, sexuality studies, or LGBT studies. In addition, colleges and universities often have clubs and organizations that are open to students that are sexual minorities. In fact, colleges and universities were the first to fight for the right to have gay student organizations, which can now be found in middle and high schools across the country. And finally, for traditional college students living on college campus, this is often the first time that they're allowed to explore sex and sexuality freely outside of the confines of their parental home. In recent years, colleges and universities have been taking steps to become more inclusive to gender nonconforming and transgender students. However, women's colleges face some of the biggest struggles, with including transgender students, since their mission is to educate women. Despite these dilemmas, research has shown that transgender students often find women's colleges attractive because they're safer, both physically and psychologically. However, women's colleges' response to transgender inclusion varies widely. Some colleges will only confer diplomas to students who are legally defined as women. Others will only take applications from applicants that are female. Some colleges are working to be much more inclusive, and instead of using the word sisterhood, one prominent institution has changed their slogan to siblinghood. And of course, there are colleges that have broadened their admission policy to include all academically qualified students, except for those who are biological males at birth and still identify that way. We can't have a discussion about collegiate sexuality without taking a moment to talk about hookup culture. Hookup culture can be defined in many different ways, and individuals often disagree on what actually constitutes a hookup. However, sexual encounters with no expectation of a commitment is not necessarily anything new on college campuses. In fact, some research suggests that this phenomenon's been occurring since the 1980s. Increasing liberal attitudes about sex and sexual behaviors that emerged following the sexual revolution of the 1960s is thought to be one of the reasons that the current hookup culture we see on college campuses has emerged. There's also been a decline in young people's interest in traditional dating. Research has also shown that students of all genders hook up, but over time, hooking up becomes more of a gendered activity. In one study, researchers found that as freshmen, both males and females embraced hookup culture because they weren't interested in being tied down in a relationship. However, after the freshman year, things began to change. While men still expressed enjoying hooking up, women began to want something more and hoped their hookups could progress into a relationship. Researchers argue that men hold a lot of power on college campuses because women outnumber men on most college campuses, and thus the status quo of a hookup culture remains.